Okay. So for this review, so last time we had a PowerPoint, this time we're actually gonna go to the Canvas page. So if you guys have already, actually, hold on, let me share my screen. And I'm sorry if I get up at any point unexpectedly. My cat can't decide whether she wants to stay in here or go outside. Okay. All right. So this time, if you want to access the review, if you just go to the Canvas page and then go to Pages, you'll be able to come across the midterm 2 review, which has everything we're gonna go over today. So if you want to refer back to it, and again, I am recording this. Oh, let me let some more people in. I'm recording this, so you guys can always check back on it later. Okay, so we'll just get started. Okay, so we're starting with the literary cultural movements, and then we're going to move over into talking a little bit about some of the themes of the class, and then we're going to do just kind of a final little review of who people are. So there's going to be a lot of sort of repetition in this. A lot of the same things are going to keep popping up, but hopefully that'll help you remember it. Okay. So first off, we've got the literary cultural movement of sentimentalism. So this is associated with the 18th and 19th centuries. The sort of ethos is that it really emphasizes feelings. Some of the major works of sentimentalism that we talked about that are relevant to this class is, of course, Nikolai Karamzin's The Isle of Bornholm from 1794. You may recall this is the one where there's like some kind of mysterious secret, and it never says explicitly, but we can tell through context clues and from our sort of modern lens that the secret is that there's incest. And this also has the character of Lisa or Liza, who is also portrayed in Orest Kaplinsky's painting, Poor
Poor
Lisa.
Lisa.
Yes, which is not this picture. This is just another picture to show sentimentalism. Um, so yeah, 18th, 19th century feelings, Karamzin, Isle of Bornholm, incest. Those are the important things. Karamzin is also associated with pre-romanticism, which then leads into actual romanticism. So romanticism is associated with the early 19th century. It is human will above nature. And the primary texts that we discussed in class that are related to romanticism are Caspar David Friedrich's painting The Wanderer Above the Sea of Fog. And then more importantly, or more relevant to this course, took up a lot more time, is Pushkin. So Pushkin, you can see down here. There's another picture of him later on. You can recognize him by his incredible sideburns. Pushkin is kind of like the poet laureate of Russia. He's kind of Russia's equivalent of Shakespeare, just in terms of like how often he's studied and talked about and how revered he is. So some of his most famous works that are relevant to this course are Ruslan and Ludmila from 1820, The Bridegroom. So The Bridegroom is the one that we read for this course. It's a poem. These are all poems. And let's see. Um, yeah, so Bridegroom was from 1825. There's also the Bronze Horseman. He's very much associated with the myth of Russia and the myth of St. Petersburg in particular with regards to the Bronze Horseman. For the Bridegroom, which is again what we read for this class, it was actually a partial inspiration for the Tim Burton movie The Corpse Bride. So we have that sort of connection into a more modern film. And then also associated with Romanticism is Mikhail Lermontov, whose best known work is Hero of Our Time. But for the purposes of this class, we talked about The Demon. So that was written in between 1829 and 1839. So yeah, Romanticism, early 19th century, human will above nature. Pushkin is the biggest name associated with it. Um, but then that also leads us to Gothic Romanticism. So Gothic Romanticism is a little bit later. So it's associated again in this class with the work of A.K. Tolstoy, who is not the most famous Tolstoy. It's not War and Peace Tolstoy. It's his second cousin. And the primary work that we talked about with Tolstoy is Family of Avordalak. And if you recall, that is the one that we read where the man goes off to kill basically a vampire, and he says, if I'm not back in 10 days, or if I return after 10 days, then I've been turned. And he shows up on the 10th day. So the Family of a Warlock is from 1839, and it was later adapted into a movie in 1963. by Mario Bava, who is credited with starting the spaghetti horror genre. So similar to this idea of the spaghetti Western, which was like Italian movies that took place in like the American West, the spaghetti horror is like Italian adaptations of horror films. So the film did have to make some changes from the story, particularly near the end of it, because the original story was so violent that it couldn't be filmed and shown in the 60s. So that's the big thing to remember. Tolstoy also wrote a short novel, The Vampire, in 1841, which was also adapted into a film called Blood Drinkers in 1991. But Blood Drinkers wasn't, it's not Mario Bava, it's a different, more recent, more contemporary director. That's Gothic Romanticism. And then we jump to Romantic realism or magical realism. So that's where a bunch of texts that we talked about in this class are under that umbrella. So famously, there's Nikolai Gogol's Vuy, which was from 1835, and his novel Dead Souls from 1842. So the thing to remember about Gogol is that Vuy in particular was very critical of the Orthodox Church. It's been adapted twice into movies. We saw clips from both of these films during class. So the first is the 1965 version of Vui, directed by Patushko. And the Patushko one, you guys might recall, is the one that had like the really great kind of like practical effects. It had, the guy with the eyelids that go all the way to the floor. And then Stepchenko, the more modern one, is from 2014. So that one does use like CGI and things of that nature. Okay, and then also in this sort of like romantic realism, also in that same kind of like mid 19th century, we have Ivan Turgenev, whose most famous work is Fathers and Sons from 1862. But for this class, what we looked at was his shorter work, Phantoms from 1863. And the important thing to note about Phantoms and Turgenev is that he's associated with social commentary and the emancipation of serfs. So it has a little bit of like a more realistic bend on the vampire genre. And we see an even more realistic one in Alexander Sukhovo-Kobylan, who was alive from 1817 to 1903, and who wrote The Death of Tarelkin, which you may recall was a play. And this is one of the works that begins to look at vampires as a political allegory. Um, which we also see a bit with Bulgakov. So Bulgakov is writing a lot of like social commentary and like satirical stuff in his often very funny and fantastical works. So again, we read When the Dead Rise from the Grave, which is the quite short story from 1922. That's the one where, the child in the family has died. And then there's sort of a question of, oh, did the child actually die? Was it an error of like note keeping, basically? Was it a lie? There's sort of this ambiguity around it. And so it is similar to Sukhovo Kobylan, where it is this kind of question of like the political ramifications or the political dimensions of a vampire story. How can this be used in a way that like comments on society? And then we also read News from Yalta, which is a selection from The Master and Margarita. The Master and Margarita was written over a period of time from 1928 until Bulgakov's death in 1940. But because of Stalin-era censorship, it was not able to be published until 1986. And then many years later, almost 20 years afterwards, in 2005, there was a television series about it. You guys may, again, recall we watched a little clip from it, and we read that selection in class. It's got, the cat turning into a man and beating the guy up, and then a werewolf, not werewolf, I'm sorry, a vampire lady comes and kisses him, and it's wonderful. Okay, yeah, so that's Bulgakov. Okay, and then getting even continuing with the more modern stuff, with realism, we looked a little bit at Jan Neruda's The Vampire, which looks at this idea of like an energy vampire, which we can also kind of see in like modern stuff with the TV adaptation of What We Do in the Shadows, where one of them is an energy vampire. So we first see that again in 1920 with Neruda. And then we move to postmodernism, which is very contemporary. So the main texts that we read for the postmodernism portion of the class were Viktor Pelevin's A Werewolf Problem in Central Russia, which again, you may recall, it's a young man who's kind of wandering in the forest and gets turned into a werewolf and is just running around with a pack of werewolves. And then we also have Lukyanenko's Night Watch, which is extremely, extremely popular. It's the first in a series of books, the second one being Day Watch. So Night Watch came out in 1994 and was adapted in 2004 into a film by a Kazakh director named Bekmambetov. It was extremely, extremely popular, made a ton of money. Yeah, again, you guys might recall we watched a little bit of that in class and we read a pretty decent chunk of that. It's the one where the vampire is kind of tracking this young man who has something about him, and keeps kind of using his power to help people and then becomes too weak for other things. All right, so those are the primary texts. Those are the primary literary and cultural movements. So for the exam, you're really going to want to be able to know to like name. You don't necessarily have to say like, for instance, sentimentalism was from the year, 1701 to 19, or however. You just want to know the kind of basic time frames. Like sentimentalism is something associated with the 18th and 19th centuries. Or you can just remember, okay, well, the Isle of Bornholm, for instance, is associated with sentimentalism and it's in the late 18th century. So things like that. You just want to have kind of a grasp of who did what and when and what it was very, very broadly. Um, okay. And then in terms of critical frameworks, we talked about Orientalism. So Orientalism is a term associated with the critic and theorist Edward Said. So he talks about like this idea of the Orient or like kind of like the East, the Oriental, and how it sort of like both others and exoticizes like people who are from the East. So it's a relatively new addition when we're talking about like Russian and Slavic contexts. It's something that traditionally has been used for talking about like the Middle East, but it is something that pops up in this course. So this is something you're going to want to be able, if you see, for instance, a photo like this or something similar, you just want to be able to kind of like recognize it when you see it, and be able to say, oh, that looks like Orientalism. We also talked a bit about gender studies and sexuality. So we talked about the difference between like homosocial, homoerotic, and homosexual. Where homosocial, again, we see this in the 1930, 1929, I don't remember, the older adaptation of Dracula, where it's this relationship where like men are constantly having these kind of like platonic relationships with each other. There are very few women involved, so they have like a sort of homosocial bond. And then homoerotic, it often has like a little bit more coding, where it's like, oh, you could potentially read this as being some kind of like erotic or sexual relationship, but we're not necessarily seeing it explicitly. It's very much in like the coding, the framing of things. And then homosexual is when it is more explicit. So, for instance, oh, what is this called? Interview with a Vampire. Um, We've got those. Okay, and then we'll just do a brief little rundown again of some of the works. And you can kind of put faces to the names. So again, this is Karamzin. So we can see here when he was alive.
1700s.
Yes. Um, so yes, Karamzin, who wrote again the Island of Bornholm, the incest story. Bornholm, again, if you don't recall, is an island off of the coast of Denmark. Um, and yeah, it had to be very subtle when he was writing about incest because that was not a word that they could really use. Okay, and then this I mentioned earlier, Caspar David Friedrich, that this is also in the sentimentalism category. This is his painting. Here we've got Pushkin again with his wonderful sideburns. Pushkin, um, as I said, is best associated with texts like The Bridegroom, with well, Yevgeny Onegin, but we don't talk about that. Yeah, The Bridegroom's the big one, The Bronze Horseman, the poet laureate of Russia. And yeah, these are some pictures of, various artistic interpretations of some of the things we've read. Okay, and then Lermontov, who did again Hero of Our Time, and sorry, what was the name of the one that we read for this class? And The Demon, yes. So yeah, he's around. He's a little bit after Pushkin. He actually writes some stuff after the death of Pushkin about him. Okay, and then this is Mikhail Vrubel. We looked at some of his artwork in class. So also, yeah, similar period. Lived a little bit longer than Lermontov. Oh yes, and this is his artwork of again another demon figure. Okay, and then when we hit the mid 1800s, that's when we've got Gogol, and again Gogol is Vuy and Dead Souls, and has a
Early 19th century.
okay. Oh yes, and then this is also from Vui.
This is Ivan Herd. He made the Phantom early to mid 19th century.
Yes. And then we've got Ivan Turgenev, who's really associated with writing about sort of social issues and the emancipation of the serfs. His most famous work is Fathers and Sons. And then A.K. Tolstoy again, who wrote The Death of the Vodolok, yes, which we see in this lovely illustration. Okay, and then we also have Mario Bava, who Italian director associated with spaghetti horror. He is the one who has helped. Uh, um, yes, he is. He did the 1960 edition of Vui. And then we go to the late 1800s. This is another incredible beard, Alexander Sokolow-Kobylin. He is the one who does The Death of Tarelkin, which is again like that very like vampirist political. Oh yes, here's a picture from a play adaptation or from an adaptation of that play. And then we have Bram Stoker. I think we've said a lot about Bram Stoker in this course. I think this same picture maybe was on the last exam. He wrote Dracula. And yeah, he is 1800s primarily. He was alive in the 20th century, but he didn't write Dracula then, so we don't really care about him at that point. Okay, and then we move to the early 1900s, and we have Nosferatu. So Nosferatu, as you might recall, does have some similarities with Dracula, but they are not. It is not an adaptation of Dracula. They were not able to adapt Dracula at first, so they had to come up with this sort of stock character of Nosferatu, who has a lot of similarities but is not the same. So Nosferatu and Dracula, not the same character, not related. Dracula here, Nosferatu here. Very, very different. One is a lot more suave, and one is a lot more, I don't want to see him in the night. Um, okay, here's another one of Bulgakov. I don't remember who it was, but someone in class pointed out that he has kind of a Daniel Craig look to him. So if his picture shows up, if you see Daniel Craig on the midterm, um, it's Bulgakov. And then here is a picture from the 2005 television adaptation of Master and Margarita. Okay, and then when we move on to the 20th century, we've got Vladimir Vysotsky, who you guys may recall died very young from or related to drinking and drug use. And his like primary sort of like contribution to the vampire mythos is his song My Funeral. So again, much like a lot of these other Soviet era writers, he had like very political writings. And he was also looking again, similar to Sokolow, he's looking at the vampire as a political figure. Okay, and then for the late 1900s, that makes me feel super old because some of these were in the 90s, which is when I was born, into the 2000s. We have Victor Pelevin, who is still alive to this day, born in 1962. Again, the work that we read for this class is a werewolf problem in central London, or sorry, not central London, in central Russia. And he does also have a book called Empire V that is like more exclusively about vampires, but they're really weird vampires. I think his portrayal of werewolves and a werewolf problem in central Russia feels a bit more in keeping with the rest of the mythology. So he's associated with postmodernism. He's like considered one of the major postmodernist voices in contemporary Russia, post-Soviet Russia. Okay, yes, we see the werewolf. Okay, and then we've also got Sergei Lukyanenko, also still alive, born in 1968. And again, he is the author of Night Watch and its sequel Day Watch, and I think there are even other books, which again was adapted into an extremely successful movie in the early 2000s. And Night Watch was for 98, and I believe Central Werewolf Problem in Central Russia was also late 90s. And that is all I have for you. And again, for those of you guys who came in late, this whole midterm review is available on the Canvas page. If you just go to pages and click midterm review, you'll be able to pull all of this up. And again, this whole thing will be recorded. So yep, that's all from me. 1991 for the Palaven story. Thank you, Glenn. All right, so yep, that's all from me. Anybody have any questions yet before we move to the official little Q&A in a few minutes?
Are you posting the recorded version like at when the other Q&A ends or
I will post this Q&A I will start uploading it as soon as like this meeting is done. Sometimes it takes a little while because it has to like, convert and stuff. But as soon as this meeting ends, I will begin uploading it. So it'll be up by like 5 o'clock at the latest, I assume, unless something horrible happens to Canvas.
Okay, thank you.
The session, if you feel comfortable with everything that we talked about in the session, then I wouldn't worry about doing too much else. If there's anything where you're like, oh, I like vaguely remember this thing that they're talking about, but I don't have like a great grasp on it, then I would recommend like maybe singling out any problem areas and then going and looking at the PowerPoints that Dr. Garza has posted throughout the semester. But I would say, again, if you feel confident in the things that we've said, if all of this makes sense to you, if you recognize everything, I wouldn't worry about it too much. Um, I would recommend using like this session and also the review sheet that we have online as a guide, where if you're going through it and you're like, oh, I don't quite remember this one, then you can go through the Canvas page and get more information until you feel comfortable. So it's really just depends on how you're feeling. Oh, yes, actually, what Gwen says is really important because part of the test is going to be through like identifying passages. So yeah, it can be really helpful to um, recognize like the writing styles, or even just recognize, oh, like here's like the key things. Like this is one is clearly about, I don't know, this one's clearly about werewolves, so it's probably this werewolf text. Um, So the review sheet is just this Canvas page that I made. So if you just go, uh, hold on, I'll show you how to do it. We just go to the Canvas page, review as a student. Um, yeah, we go to the Canvas page and then we go and we just click pages and then view all pages. And then I believe it's the very bottom. Um, yeah, so we go to the very bottom, we hit midterm two review, and that will bring you to this page. And I will, when I upload the recording of this, I'm just going to upload it as a response to the announcement. So that's where everything will be. The format of the midterm is basically, yeah, it's basically the same as last time. It's going to be, um, multiple choice questions, everything you're just going to get to select. The only difference is that it doesn't have quite as many pictures as last time. It has more like passage identification. But other than that, yes, it's the same as last time.
I think the only other notable difference is this one also has an extra credit session section, but I mean the format for that will still be the same where it's like matching. So
Apologize if there are any weird noises coming from my end. My cat is aggressively licking herself very close to the microphone, so I apologize. Um, all right. Yes, Jerry, I see your hand is raised.
Yeah, hi. Wait, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay. I was just wondering, about the quotes, cause, um, like as I mentioned, like that was just my main worry since like it's memorization.
Mhm.
But like, are there like any specific quotes or like areas of text we should look at? Cause since it's a lot of text,
Mhm.
I'm just scared that like I won't remember what's on the stuff that I would actually need for the exam. So like, I don't know if that makes sense, but.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I will say that there's nothing on here or there's nothing on the exam that's not on this review. So if you just, I don't know, it might be helpful to like look at kind of the format of different things. So for instance, some things you could be able to recognize because it's like, oh, this is a poet, this is a poem, you know. So like for instance, like Pushkin is writing poetry. So, you know, if you're looking at that, if you're looking like at a poem, for instance, and the options are, let's say, like, I don't know, Pushkin, Bulgakov, um, Solzhenitsyn, who's not in this course, you know, you would have a good guess that it's poetry. So it's a little bit less like, do you have this whole thing memorized? And a little bit more like contextually, can you connect like the chunk of text to a particular author? So that's why when I was going over the review, I was like trying to say specifically like what each person is associated with so that you don't necessarily have to recognize, you know, oh, this chapter, or, you know, this paragraph is from, you know, family of a Bordelot. You can just be like, okay, this thing mentions something that is part of, you know, the main idea of this other thing. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Yeah, I mean, most of the text, like, as you said, then, yeah, like contextually based off of what it's talking about, I could guess what it is. It's just like maybe like a couple texts that maybe I don't remember.
Mhm.
Um, like for example, since you're on here, like, I don't remember if we did When the Dead Rise from the Grave, but I
Mhm.
do remember like News from Yalta.
Mhm. Okay. Yeah. Well, in that case, like if there's any of these that like you're like, did I read that? I would recommend maybe skimming over it. When the Dead Rise from the Grave is quite short. I think it's like a 3 pages. I know some of these are quite long, and I wouldn't be like, you should just reread every single thing we read. Um, but yeah, maybe just go through and like see which of these do you feel like you could recognize just kind of like out of the blue, and which of these are you like, I have no idea what this one was about, and just like give it a just like skim over it so that you could potentially recognize um yeah, what that is. And I think also it can help if you're thinking about it in terms of like when did these things come out. So for instance, like the writing style of somebody like Lukianenko or Pilyapin is going to be really different from the writing style of you know, like Turgenev, for instance. Um, so yeah, that would be my recommendation. Or like The Death of Tarelkin is a play, you know, so if you get like a text, like a chunk of text and it's in the format of a play, you know, it's probably that because I think that's the only play we read.
Okay, thank you so much.
All right, I am getting the notification that we are running out of meeting time, so I am going to end this one and then work on uploading it. And if you guys want to move over to the next Zoom meeting, where the Q&A is, then we will meet you there.
Thank you.